email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Richard Boyatzis, a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University and author of 9 books, including Primal Leadership. We resumed the conversation with a discussion about the cumulative effects of stress and anxiety on mental ability and emotional intelligence. You know, we were talking about tunnel vision a moment ago, and there was a place in the book where it talks about distress and anxiety can have a negative effect on both mental ability and emotional intelligence. And that's a direct effect of the tunnel vision we were discussing, right?
Yes. And well, the very nature of even mild, annoying stress, you know, your cell phone drops a call, somebody tries to cut you off in traffic, those things build up in any given day. And most of us, the people who study the amount of this stuff, have said most of us in professional or executive positions have 8 to 12 episodes a day. Some people have more. And if you're not interrupting that with the opposite, this renewal experience, all of these hormones are compiling. Your blood pressure goes higher, your breathing gets faster, and what happens is your immune system turns off. On top of that, your ability to create new neurons in your brain, called neurogenesis, stops. So there's a lot to say how the mechanism of why when we're under this accumulated or chronic annoying stress, nevertheless acute stress of a pandemic, social disruptions, political disruptions, etc. All
Right.
of that's it's really over the top. There's no doubt. I mean, I was saying this last spring, which used to bother people, especially if they had people that were, you know, they knew that were dying. But and it is sad that if anybody died from COVID, very sad, that the real loss, the real disruption coming from the COVID virus, for most people wasn't the risk of infection. It was actually the financial or mental health. And now we're seeing that. And we,
Sure.
all of us who are talking about the future know that, you know, unless people are really being foolish and not getting vaccinated, the world will, I don't know about the world, but most of the countries will be vaccinated within the next few months.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the more developing countries may take another month or two later than that. But you're talking about the fact that by next fall, we should be way beyond herd immunity.
Right.
But we're
So-
not going to be on the psychological or the stress-related effects. And there's going to be a lot of what, you know, when you're in the military is now called PTSD. But, you know, my parents and my in-laws grew up during the Depression. And it didn't matter what country you're in, whether it was Greece or where my parents came from, or England, where my wife's, or in America. It was a massive shock to the system. And even into the 80s and 90s, folks that were growing up during the Depression tended to have their money in a lot of different banks because they didn't trust banks.
Right.
You know, the banking system had changed a lot in the ensuing 50 or 60 or 70 years, but that lingers.
Sure.
I think we're going to see not the same kind of problem, but I think we're going to see related issues from the long tail of the effects of COVID.
You know, this conversation has helped me already because my whole life, I just thought some people were morning people and some weren't. But what you're saying basically is the morning people, as the day's gone on, those accumulated stresses have just, and they're not able to offload them somehow or put the positive, I guess, injection points back in. It just builds on them all day and they become a lot more difficult to deal with in the evening than they were in the morning.
It was a major theme in our 2005 book, excuse me, in another article that Professor Melvin Smith, and Nancy Blaze and I published in 2006. But in our latest book, this Helping People Change, we really zeroed in on the fact that if people don't have a steady dose of brief periods, 10 to 15 minute periods of renewal throughout a day, you're burning up, not burning out, you're burning up. And Dan Goleman and I developed a new test about 6 years ago that just got published in an American Psychological Association journal called Consulting Psychology. And one of the things that we did was a lot of the existing research focused on degree of stress, under the assumption that you're better off if you lower your amount of stress. Well, the mistake was even mild stress causes degrees of cognitive and emotional and perceptual impairment. So what we started to say was we have to alert people and we have to help people build a different personal sensitivity to renewal, which is the antidote to stress. Well, we did this research to look at what happens in a normal day. The prior research had looked at exceptional events. Of course, we're in a period of an exceptional stressful event, and other events. And one of the things that was very clear is that if you balance each week the amount of renewal moments against the amount of stress moments, that basically you have higher sense of well-being, better job satisfaction, better life satisfaction, more empathy, more resilience, less anxiety, less depression. And it was all the more engagement, all the things we're looking for. And the variety of things you use to engage renewal was also a very strong predictor of all these good things. So what that meant was, if you always reverted to the same thing, like every time you wanted to renew, you stopped and did 15 minutes of yoga, it would help. But if you always do the yoga or always pray, it doesn't help as much as if you mix it up. So you do a variety of things.
What are some examples besides yoga and meditation?
Well, yoga, meditation, martial arts, Tai Chi, which is the centering, not the kick-ass parts. Prayer helps, but there's an interesting caveat there. The research is stronger on when you pray to a loving God. If you're praying to a vengeful God, you're a sinner, you've got to repent. It seems that it stimulates the stress response.
Okay.
Moderate exercise. That's why the exercise physiologists are saying, walking and swimming are better for you if you do steady amounts and get your heart rate up to a certain level. Being in a loving relationship helps. Caring for people less advantaged than you or in need helps. Caring for the elderly helps. I tell my students caring for your elderly professors is going to be very healthy for you. Having a dog or cat, or in some parts of the country or the world, a horse or a monkey helps. And we've known actually it's been published since the 70s. It's the petting, the stroking. So I have 2 golden retrievers, and we've always had 2 over the decades. My wife and I have been married. And I, like you, I started out as an engineer, so I'm very analytic. I'm kind of nerdy. And it's easy for me to be so focused, and that's how I get a lot of stuff done. But I'm so focused at times, I don't notice other things happening around me. And I remember some 35 years ago, my wife saying, when one of the Goldens we've always had, and now are usually 2 are females, saying, one of the girls comes up to you and wants some attention, stop what you're doing. Now I've got the proof that she was right. I mean, she didn't need the proof. She knew she was right. But now, if one of my 2 golden retrievers comes up to me, and I'll stop, I'll pet her, and then she goes into a parasympathetic because of the emotional contagion, I pick it up, and then I'm going more to, and then she is, and we're having a whole renewal moment there.
Right.
There are a couple other things, as you talked about earlier. Laughter, joy, and playfulness does that. And a walk in the woods has now been shown with enough studies. There may be other things for each person, but until a person learns the internal, what are called somatic or biomarkers, what are the sensations in you that says you're in renewal, you're not going to be kind of sensitive to those activities. A lot of people confuse renewal with rest. You need rest, but it's not the same. They confuse it with relaxing. It's not the same. So renewal is a particular state. A lot of us have it naturally. And the question is, when you become tuned to recognizing it, I mean, look, most of us know what stress feels like, but we're not that well tuned to know what's a renewal moment. But once you get that awareness, which isn't hard, it's amazing that you can actually intentionally produce it. You and I, we were talking just a few minutes back about humor, and being able to say something at a dinner or a meal with family, or, doing something with friends or colleagues that helps everybody, enables everybody to laugh, is one of those moments of renewal. In a sense, it gives a break from the stress hormones to the opposite.
I don't know if there's science to back this up, but I do know that when I'm laughing with someone, I feel more connected to them, and
Yes.
there's a bit of trust that comes up there when I'm doing that.
Actually, there is neurological evidence showing exactly why that happens, and some hormonal too. But the fact is that you're activating this state with this empathic network that allows you to be open to them.
Okay. I've seen a lot recently about you are the people you surround yourself with. And I guess that's kind of what we're talking about today, is the mirroring that happens, and you're picking up on that person's emotions.
Yes.
So if you're around negative people all the time, you tend to be drawn into the negative. But if you surround yourself with positive people, it tends to pull you up.
And in organizations, it's one of the dangers we slide into without thinking about it. It's very seductive, because if we have in our organization functional silos, if you're always around financial people, if you're always around engineers, if you're always around salespeople, then what happens is you start to think that there's only one way to look at the world.
Right.
And, we're living in an era in which there is way too much narcissism. I mean, it's rampant. I mean, the example I used in one of the chapters of helping people change was, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? And if you think about, I mean, my wife and I had a chance to get a break a few months ago and went down to St. Thomas for a week. We'd be sitting on, lying on the chair on the beach and, enjoying the sun and reading. And it was amazing how many people spent most of their time not interacting with others, but standing in the water, either knee high or waist high, taking pictures of themselves.
Right.
Now, when you add to that this consequence of living in silos, of listening to people who have the similar views to you do, watching those television stations that report the news that agree with you, reading newspapers that agree with you, you're in a cocoon.
Right.
And, in no time at all, you think the rest of the world is like you. So now you've got narcissism with self-righteousness. And that's what's plaguing us right now at the national level.
Sure.
And because of all of that kind of self-righteous thinking, and it's all sides. It's coming from the Democrats and the Republicans, the conservatives and the liberals, and and it's scary.
Two things that I think of right away. One is that we don't have conversations anymore. We just yell at each other, basically. We build our foxholes and we just scream, and we say we're having a conversation, but we're really not. We're just yelling at you and thinking, why are you such an idiot when I'm right? And I think that comes from, like you were talking about, being in the cocoon. I have people that I'm friends with that on social media that 180 degrees do not agree with their opinions, right? But I don't block them because I need to know that opinion is out there. And, I tell people all the time in conversations, you have to understand that opinion is valid to them. Whether you believe it or not, it's valid to them, and you have to recognize that it's a valid opinion for them, or you're not going to be able to have a dialogue and really, really grow.
Yeah, it's really sad. I mean, I had an interaction with an editor of a periodical recently in which I said, I think in many of your pieces, there's a bias. I mean, it's all. I live in Massachusetts, so it wasn't surprising that it was particularly kind of left-wing bias. And he wrote back to me and said he took an instant dislike to me and assumed that I was a conservative. And I said, I'm not. I'm one of these rare people that is a moderate. I mean, I have some views that are strongly liberal, and I have some views that are, I don't know about strongly, but are more conservative. And the ultimate test, I remember having an argument with one of my friends 4 or 5 years ago about this, and I thought about it. And the next time we had lunch together in Boston, I said, by the way, you said, when I said I was a moderate, you said, yeah, a lot of people like to say that about themselves. I said, I actually tabulated, and in national elections, since I started voting, 40% of the time I voted for Democrats, 40% of the time for Republicans, and 20% of the time for independents. I said, that to me is kind of a signal that, I'm moderate and it depends on the particular issues and the person
Sure.
and this and that. And of course, he took that as more extremist rhetoric. So my point to this editor was, isn't it sad that we can't disagree on ideas without condemning the other person?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that in primal leadership as well, is that we don't have the
Right.
ability to have just a general discourse. It has to be,
Yeah, and we wrote that 20 years ago. I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah. And nothing has changed, unfortunately, right? And we go into,
gotten worse. It's gotten a lot worse.
yeah,
And now it's very confusing because a lot of the current movements, which are variously called the cancel culture,
right,
are shutting down voice because they disagree on one or more issues. And as somebody writing an op-ed piece recently said, in the 50s, that was called blacklisting, except the people that we disagreed with, made better movies. And, what the McCarthy era was of closing people down from a more right-wing perspective, we're now experiencing from a more left-wing perspective, where you have to have one view. And if you disagree on any part of it, you're against all of it, which is, of course, absurd.
right. And it's not just politics. I mean, I don't usually talk about this, but
Yeah.
I'm plant-based. So I eat only fruits and vegetables, plant stuff, and used to call myself a vegan, but then I can't because apparently I don't match all of the things that come with being a vegan, right? I'm not anti everything. So I'm not allowed to call myself a vegan.
Yeah, you eat eggs?
I don't know. No, I don't do any dairy, but to be a vegan, you have no fish, just fruits and vegetables. But to be a vegan, you have to say, I'm anti, you can't wear leather and there's so many things.
Oh, I see. You're talking about other than what goes into your food.
Right. But to label
Right.
yourself a vegan,
Right.
you have to take all these other things on, and it almost comes militaristic. And so I'm like, well, I'm not going to call myself a vegan. I'm plant-based because that's really what I am. But it's easier to say vegan.
Clint, I think that's a great example. Yes, it's true that if you wanted to take it, you could always go to more sensitivity around it.
Right.
It's like environmental causes. I mean, my wife and I, even when we were living in Cleveland in our suburban neighborhood, but now we're in a really national park, but where we live on Cape Cod, you go to the transfer station and there are 27 different ways to separate out what you're about to unload into the transfer station. And anybody who goes to the transfer station does it. But back when we were living in Cleveland, we were amazed at the number of especially 30 and 40-year-old families who didn't bother recycling, because we could see, especially if I'm walking the dogs on Sunday night and they pick up the garbage or the trash and all that on Monday mornings, you could see whether or not people have all the different multicolored bags and bins and all that. Well, I remember when we put 27 solar panels on our house in Cleveland Heights. There were a few people who had done it before, but it turned out there was only one really major installer in the whole city. And Cleveland Heights is right next to Shaker Heights. And I was glad I found her because she ended up doing a lot of that work at my university at Case Western Reserve, also around solar and wind and renewable forms of energy. But as soon as you start to think about environmental impact, you can always go another notch. I mean, as you and I were talking about earlier, one of the things that the increasing use of Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Skyping has done is enabled people to be able to have a lot of conversations without having to get on planes,
Right.
or not driving long distances, all of which have negative impact, especially planes, on the atmosphere. So as we increase our sensitivity, there are always higher levels of standards.
Yeah.
And it's too bad that a person who is at a more sensitive or extreme position looks at everybody else and says, well, you're the opposite.
Right.
Because you may not be the opposite.
Yeah. I may be 90% of what you believe, but somehow I'm the enemy. It's
Right.
like you said
And
earlier, it's 100%. You're
and as
all
you
in
said,
or all out.
I mean, 20 years ago, we were talking about this. So This is not new. And in fact, I remember writing, having a series of positions about how to teach ethics and leadership, which finally, because of the neuroscience research, we published a paper in the Journal of Business Ethics about this. A lot of people thought the way to teach ethics and leadership is to teach ethical decision-making case studies. What happens in those case studies is you're either teaching, are you right or wrong? And then the other issue is, have you incorporated different positions, or it's not black or white, it's gray? Well, we showed in our paper that if you really wanted to open people up to broader, inclusive ethical thinking, you would activate this empathic network more. And how do you do it? Not by doing analytic work, which is moving toward a right-wrong judgment. It's doing more interpersonal work, more emotional work. That enables you to activate the neural network that actually opens you up to people who are different than you are. So if we really wanted to teach how to have diversity of thought, we have to teach the interpersonal abilities to be open to the diversity of thought.
Okay. I deal with a lot in project teams, and in the book, in Primal Leadership, you talk about, I think the example was Sam, who was an R&D, he was a biochemist, and his career was going great until he got promoted to be the head of R&D.
Right.
And it's really about, you're talking about leadership styles. And I see that a lot in the project work that I do, where the engineer with really great technical skills gets promoted to be a project manager and fails miserably. So can you talk about, why the skill that got you to that level doesn't maintain you?
We've known in terms of research, or a lot of people have known far longer than that you don't always promote the best salesperson to be the sales manager.
Right.
Why don't you promote the best athlete on a team to be the coach? It might work, but most of the time it doesn't, because there are a different set of abilities that are required from it. It's a different, some of my colleagues, one called Carol Dweck, a psychologist, has talked about mindset. Your whole attitude or mindset ends up being different in these roles, because when you move from being an individual contributor to being a manager or leader, now your job is not to come up with a great idea, not to solve the problem, not to close the sale. It's to help other people do those things. And that's where, if the more and more you're into being an individual contributor, if that's where you get your jollies, then you really shouldn't go into management or leadership, because that's not where you're going to, feel the music of life ringing in your ears. I was working closely in the very early 80s, 1980 through 83 or so, with IBM. My company was McBurr. We were doing a bunch of competency research. And I was at, one of their key facilities in Armonk. And I remember when the folks in HR were sharing an astonishing discovery. They launched their PC division in Boca Raton, and, that really helped the whole industry of personal computers. But what IBM did was they realized that if we're going to do this and it's going to be innovative, we have to somehow disengage the division from all of the various committees and help that is given to any division that tends to strangle time to innovate. So they went worldwide to, I think at the time, I thought somebody said was 340,000 employees. And they said, here are all the jobs we're listing for this division. If you're interested in any of those jobs, you can apply. And if you take the job and it's below your current salary level, we'll keep your salary level where it is. You won't get increases for the next few years. But when and if you want to go back into one of the other divisions at the level you were before, we'll place you there, and then you'll be eligible for other promotions and salary increases, etc. Well, they were blown away by the fact that 75% of the people who had applied for the individual contributor jobs, the sales, the training, the quality inspections, etc., the manufacturing engineering jobs, were people from management.
Wow.
So what it said was a lot of people went into management because, well, they might be under social pressure. It's a little more status, or they might want more pay.
Right.
But they were shocked by that. And I wasn't, because I think a lot of people love it. It's, Ed Schein, a very famous in our field professor from MIT, had developed a notion called career anchors. And he said, whatever your career anchor is, it doesn't mean you can't do the other job, but it means that at some point you're going to be fed up with it.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of these are the roles. They do have the emotional piece that, I don't want to be a stereotypical person, but a lot of times engineers get labeled as not having the emotions, as being the Sheldons, who is obviously a scientist, always giving the Wolowitz a hard time for only being an engineer, right? So,
right.
But they don't have that emotional piece. And sometimes I think that they need some help, which is where the research that you do comes into play in your new book, especially. How do you give the person the ability to not be a Sheldon, but to actually have the ability to deal with people? Because that's so important in teamwork.
Right. And the whole idea is that, whether you talk about it as stress and renewal or these neural networks of analytic, empathic, of course we have to be doing all of them. And the dilemma is, if you're really going to be effective, whether as a team leader and a project team, or as a CEO, you have to be able to what we often call toggle back and forth. Again, Professor Tony Jack has often talked about this as like a seesaw. I think that's a good analogy, but it's the facility with moving back and forth that if a person develops, that really helps them. It helps them because they can pursue a lot of what they need to pursue at different times in different ways. And we get locked in.
Yeah. Even with the leadership styles you talked about in the book,
right?
You need the ability to move between them. You don't just have one leadership style and that's what you use on everything, right? You actually have to switch between leadership styles based on the situation, the people, the dynamics.
That's exactly right. And without that degree of flexibility, you're not going to produce adaptive interactions. I mean, and let's face it, most of the time, we're not just doing the same thing repetitively. We're having to adapt it either to different customers or different staff. And that's the thing that ends up being tough. I mean, there was, we, in our my wife's and my perpetual pursuit to find new streaming options, there was a BBC show, I think it was BBC, it was a British comedy show called The IT Crowd, which was kind of like the IT version of the British Office, The Office.
Right.
And one of the actors who's playing this IT guy, whenever they would get a call, and of course their office was in the basement, he would actually stop and put the phone and play a recording and said, "Have you turned your machine on and off again? Have you checked, is it plugged in?" And he wouldn't even talk to people until they got through this kind of thing. Yeah, that happens.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was in the Navy on an aircraft carrier, as we talked about offline. I was an electrician, and we'd have these trouble tickets that you had to, every day you come into the office and there'd be all these trouble calls, and you go out and you pick up some and you go out. And so I went into this one space where the complaint was the lights were out. So I go in, and the guy who filed the complaint, I said, "So, where's the light switch?" He goes, "I don't know." He says, "Every day the lights are always on. Every day I come in, the lights are on. So I don't know." So I search and I find the light switch and I turn the lights on. And so the best part was I got to write the resolution on the trouble ticket was placed ON/OFF switch and ON position.
And that was one of the fastest resolutions of a sit rep that you had, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, you've been great today, Richard. I've really enjoyed our conversation. If people want to learn more about you or follow the work you're doing, I know you've got some online courses that have a tremendous amount of people who follow those. How can they do that?
Well, the easiest way for most people is through the books, and the more human-friendly books, the practitioner books. As we said, the most recent that came out from Harvard Business Review Press was Helping People Change. And then the earlier ones, Primal Leadership, Resonant Leadership, Becoming a Resonant Leader, all happen to be published through Harvard Business Review Press. The next level up are the MOOCs, the Massive Open Online Courses. And I've got 3 of them on Coursera. It's free to enroll in Coursera. It's free to take most of these courses for, I think, 7 days. And most of the courses have either 15 to 24 modules, each with about a 10-minute video and some exercises. Or if you're really interested in more skill building, then you come to my university, Case Western Reserve University, and we have a number of master's degree programs, all designed for the people to, eventually come back to flying in, 4 times a year or 5 times a year for some intensive work, and the rest online in positive organization development and executive MBA. But there are also certificate programs so people could do this for a few days. And the important issue is the reading helps you become aware. But if you don't do the exercises or the interpersonal interactions where you're trying some things and practicing them, you actually don't really change. And that's where sometimes the courses help. Even in meditation and yoga, if you've never done, I used to teach meditation back in the 70s when I was doing therapy with alcoholics and drug addicts. But if you've never done meditation or yoga, to get started, you really have to take a course because you need the guidance, you need the mental preparation. So some of that helps.
Okay. Well, Richard, thanks for the conversation.
Clint, it was great.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.